Imagine paying 2 cents for an acre of land and then discovering that beneath the frozen surface sits the largest oil field ever found in North America. Imagine buying a piece of territory so vast it dwarfs Texas 3 times over, and then watching as gold, copper, zinc, natural gas, timber, and fisheries pour out of it for more than a century. Now imagine that the country who sold it to you, the country that once called this land its own, got almost nothing for it, and spent the next 150 years watching from across a narrow stretch of icy water as their former possession made someone else fantastically rich. That is the story of Alaska, and it is, without exaggeration, one of the most lopsided deals in the entire history of geopolitics. The purchase of Alaska by the United States from Russia in 1867 was not just a real estate transaction. It was a transfer of unimaginable wealth, strategic military power, and geopolitical leverage, all disguised at the time as a frozen wasteland that nobody wanted. The Americans, who mocked the deal, called it a polar bear garden. The Russians, who signed it away, believed they were offloading a burden. And both sides, in their own way, were completely wrong about what they held in their hands. To understand how one of the greatest land deals in human history came to pass, you have to go back much further than 1867. You have to go back to a time when Russia was not just a European power, but also a Pacific one, when fur traders and explorers pushed across the frozen expanse of Siberia, crossed the Bering Strait, and planted the flag of the Russian Empire on a continent that already had millions of indigenous inhabitants who had been living there for thousands of years. It starts in 1725. Tsar Peter the Great, one of the most ambitious rulers in Russian history, lay on his deathbed. Among the final orders he issued before dying was a command to his navy officer, Vitus Bering, a Danish-born explorer serving the Russian crown. Peter wanted to know a deceptively simple thing. Where does Siberia end? Is there land beyond the eastern edge of Russia, across the water? And if so, who controls it? Bering set out on what would become one of the most consequential voyages of exploration in the 18th century. The first expedition in 1728 confirmed that Asia and North America were separated by a strait, the body of water that would eventually bear his name. But it was the second expedition, launched in 1741, that truly changed everything. Bering's ships reached the Alaskan coast, and the crew brought back something that set the Russian imagination on fire. They returned with pelts, specifically sea otter pelts, among the most luxurious, sought-after furs in the entire world. These were not ordinary animal skins. Sea otter fur is the densest of any mammal on the planet, with roughly 1 million hair follicles per square inch. In Chinese and European markets, a single prime pelt could fetch staggering prices. And suddenly, Russia had found a place that was teeming with them. What followed was a rush. Not a gold rush, not yet, but a fur rush. Between 1740 and 1800, more than 40 Russian merchant expeditions sailed to the Aleutian Islands and the Alaskan coast. Hunters, trappers, and traders poured in, slaughtering sea otters, fur seals, and other animals in numbers that are difficult to comprehend. These were not explorers with noble ambitions. These were men driven by profit, often operating under brutal conditions, and imposing those conditions on the indigenous Unangax people of the Aleutian Islands with devastating consequences. Hostages were taken, families were torn apart. Entire communities were forced into labor to harvest the very furs that were enriching their colonizers. The wealth flowing back to Russia from these expeditions was real, but it came at an enormous human cost. By 1784, Russia had established its first permanent settlement in Alaska, on Kodiak Island. And in 1799, Tsar Paul I granted a monopoly over the entire Alaskan fur trade to a single entity, the Russian-American Company. This was Russia's version of the Dutch East India Company, or the British East India Company, a state-chartered corporation that was expected to not only turn a profit, but also colonize, govern, and expand the Russian presence in North America. The Russian-American Company set up its headquarters in a town called New Archangel, which is present-day Sitka, Alaska. At its peak, Sitka was an unlikely outpost of European civilization in the middle of the wilderness, a place that earned the nickname the Paris of the Pacific because of its relative sophistication compared to the surrounding territory. Russian Orthodox missionaries built churches, administrators governed a vast stretch of coastline, and the fur trade, for a time, was fabulously profitable. But the Russian-American Company had a fundamental problem that it could never solve. Alaska was impossibly far from everything that mattered in the Russian Empire. The distance from St. Petersburg to Sitka is roughly 7,500 miles. Supplying the colony required either shipping goods across the Pacific from Siberian ports, which themselves were nearly impossible to reach overland, or arranging complex and expensive trade routes through foreign intermediaries. Every barrel of flour, every crate of tools, every piece of military equipment had to travel an absurd distance. And permanent Russian settlers in Alaska never numbered more than about 400 people at any given time. 400 people trying to administer and defend a piece of land larger than most European countries combined. This logistical nightmare was manageable when the fur trade was booming. But over the decades, something predictable happened. The Russians hunted the sea otters nearly to extinction. The animals that had drawn them to Alaska in the first place were disappearing. Populations crashed, profits fell. And by the mid-1800s, the Russian-American company was bleeding money. Then came the Crimean War, and this is where the story takes a sharp turn toward the deal that changed everything. In 1853, Russia went to war against a coalition of the Ottoman Empire, Britain, and France. The Crimean War, which lasted until 1856, was a catastrophe for Russia on almost every front. The Russian military was exposed as outdated and poorly equipped compared to the Western powers. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died. And critically, the war left Russia buried under a mountain of debt that its economy was utterly unprepared to handle. Now, consider the position of Tsar Alexander II, who inherited the throne in 1855, right in the middle of this disaster. He looked at the books and saw a sprawling empire that was financially crippled. He looked at Alaska, thousands of miles away, generating almost no revenue, defended by a skeleton crew, and utterly vulnerable to seizure by the British Navy, which was the most powerful naval force on the planet at the time. Britain's Hudson's Bay Company was already encroaching on Russian territory from the south, having negotiated a lease on a portion of the Alaskan mainland. If another war broke out with Britain, and many in St. Petersburg believed it was only a matter of time, Alaska would be lost without a shot being fired. Russia simply did not have the ships or the soldiers to defend it, so the calculus became coldly pragmatic. If Russia was going to lose Alaska anyway, why not sell it to someone else, someone who might actually pay for it, and someone who was not Britain? The ideal buyer, from Russia's perspective, was the United States of America. The Americans were seen as a friendly power. They had no recent history of conflict with Russia. And most importantly, selling Alaska to the Americans would deny the British a foothold on the Pacific that they desperately wanted. It was, in a sense, a geopolitical spite sale. Russia could not keep Alaska, but they could make sure their greatest rival did not get it. Russia first floated the idea of selling Alaska during the administration of President James Buchanan in 1859, but the timing was terrible. The United States was sliding toward its own existential crisis, the Civil War, and no one in Washington had the bandwidth or the political capital to negotiate a major land purchase. So the offer sat on the shelf for nearly a decade. It was not until the Civil War ended in 1865 that the conversation resumed in earnest, and the man who picked it up, the man without whom this deal almost certainly would not have happened, was William Henry Seward, the Secretary of State. Seward was a fascinating figure. He had served as a senator from New York, had been a serious contender for the Republican presidential nomination in 1860, losing to Abraham Lincoln, and then accepted the role of Secretary of State under Lincoln's administration. He was famously ambitious, relentlessly political, and a committed expansionist. Seward believed that the future of the United States depended on acquiring territory beyond the continental borders, particularly in the Pacific and the Caribbean. He wanted naval bases. He wanted trade routes. He wanted to project American power across the oceans. And when the Russian offer came back across his desk, he saw an opportunity that most of his contemporaries completely missed. In December of 1866, Baron Edward de Stuckel, the Russian minister to the United States, returned to Washington after consulting with Tsar Alexander II and Foreign Minister Alexander Gorchakov in St. Petersburg. He carried with him instructions to negotiate the sale of Alaska with a minimum asking price of $5 million in gold. The negotiations happened with remarkable speed and under circumstances that are almost cinematic. On the evening of March 30th, 1867, Stuckel visited Seward at his home and told him that Russia was ready to finalize the deal. Seward, who was reportedly playing whist with his family, immediately agreed to go to the State Department that very night. The two men, along with their aides, worked through the early hours of the morning, and by 4 o'clock in the morning on March 31st, the Treaty of Cession was signed. The final price was $7.2 million in gold. For that sum, the United States acquired 586,412 square miles of territory. That is an area more than twice the size of Texas, more than 3 times the size of California. It works out to roughly 2 cents per acre, 2 cents, for an acre of land that, as the world would eventually discover, was sitting on top of one of the largest concentrations of natural wealth anywhere on the planet. But the American public, and much of Congress, did not see it that way. Not even close. The reaction was immediate, loud, and overwhelmingly negative. Newspaper editorials savaged the deal. Critics in Congress called the territory worthless, a barren icebox with no conceivable value. They called it a frozen wasteland populated only by polar bears and seals. The purchase quickly acquired a collection of mocking nicknames that have entered American folklore. It was called Seward's Folly. It was called Seward's Icebox. It was called Walrussia. And, perhaps most memorably, it was called Andrew Johnson's Polar Bear Garden. a jab at both the Secretary of State and the deeply unpopular president who supported the deal. The political dynamics made the opposition even fiercer. President Andrew Johnson, who had assumed office after Lincoln's assassination, was locked in a bitter struggle with radical Republicans in Congress over Reconstruction. Johnson was one of the most disliked presidents in American history, even during his own time in office. Anything associated with Johnson was, by extension, politically toxic. And so the Alaska Purchase became collateral damage in a larger political war. The Senate, led by Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, who chaired the Foreign Relations Committee, did approve the treaty relatively quickly by a vote of 37-2 on April 9, 1867. Sumner delivered a 3-hour speech in favor of the purchase, meticulously detailing Alaska's potential in terms of fisheries, fur trade, timber, and mineral wealth. He even suggested the name Alaska, derived from an Aleut word meaning great land. But the House of Representatives was another matter entirely, because the treaty required an appropriation of funds to actually pay Russia, and because spending bills originated in the House, the deal was held hostage for more than a year by hostile congressmen who refused to allocate the money. The debate was bitter. House Republicans argued that Congress was being asked to throw money at a rugged wilderness with no valuable resources and no strategic purpose. The formal transfer of Alaska to the United States took place on October 18, 1867, with a flag-raising ceremony in Sitka. But the actual payment was not approved until July 14, 1868, by a vote of 113 to 43. The check for $7.2 million was issued on August 1, 1868. It was made payable to Edward de Stuckel. The canceled check still exists today, preserved in the National Archives. And then for decades, Alaska seemed to prove its critics right. The territory received almost no investment, almost no attention, and almost no settlers. The federal government treated it as an afterthought. There was no territorial government, no meaningful infrastructure, no real economic activity beyond small-scale fishing and what was left of the fur trade. Alaska was, in the eyes of most Americans, exactly what the newspapers had said, a frozen, empty nothing. But underneath the silence, the ice, and the indifference, something extraordinary was waiting. The first shock came in the 1890s, and it came in the form of gold. The discovery that would change Alaska's reputation forever actually happened just across the border in Canada's Yukon Territory. On August 16, 1896, a prospector named George Washington Carmack, along with 2 Tagish First Nation members known as Skookum Jim and Dawson Charlie, found gold deposits on Rabbit Creek, a tributary of the Klondike River. The creek would later be renamed Bonanza Creek, and for good reason. The gold that had been washed down the mountains by the Yukon River over thousands of years had settled in sandbars and beaches along its tributaries, creating some of the richest placer deposits ever found. News traveled slowly from such a remote region. It was not until the following summer that the outside world learned what had been discovered. On July 14, 1897, the steamer Excelsior arrived in San Francisco carrying passengers with $750,000 in gold. 3 days later, the steamship Portland docked in Seattle with even more, roughly $800,000 worth. The newspapers went berserk. Headlines screamed about a ton of gold arriving from the Klondike. And just like that, the gold rush was on. An estimated 100,000 people set out for the Klondike. They came from every walk of life: bankers, farmers, clerks, teachers, doctors, drifters, dreamers, and the desperate. They boarded ships bound for the Alaskan ports of Skagway and Dyea, which served as jumping-off points for the treacherous overland route to the Canadian goldfields. The Chilkoot Pass and the White Pass became legendary corridors of human suffering. Avalanches, hypothermia, malnutrition, and sheer exhaustion killed hundreds along the trail. Of the 100,000 who started, perhaps 30,000 ever reached the goldfields. And of those, only a small fraction struck it rich. But here is the critical detail for our story. Even though the richest Klondike deposits were on the Canadian side of the border, the entire gold rush was funneled through Alaska. Skagway, Dyea, and other Alaskan ports exploded into boomtowns overnight. Merchants, saloon keepers, outfitters, and suppliers made fortunes selling goods to prospectors at wildly inflated prices. Seattle, which served as the main staging area, saw $25 million in goods sold to stampeders in just 8 months. And crucially, the gold rush did not stay in Canada. Prospectors began finding significant deposits within Alaska itself. In 1899, gold was discovered at Nome on Alaska's western coast, triggering a second stampede. The Nome gold rush was in some ways even more dramatic than the Klondike because the gold was found in the beach sand itself. You could literally scoop it up with a shovel. Thousands of miners abandoned the Klondike and raced to Nome, and the Alaskan economy began to transform. Then came Fairbanks. In 1902, an Italian immigrant named Felix Pedro discovered gold near what would become the city of Fairbanks in Alaska's interior. The Fairbanks gold rush drew another wave of settlers and prospectors, and the town grew into a permanent settlement. one of the few gold rush communities that did not simply collapse when the easy deposits ran out. Suddenly, the frozen wasteland that Congress had nearly refused to buy was generating enormous wealth. The discovery of gold in the late 1890s vindicated Seward's vision, or at least it seemed to. Alaska was no longer a joke. It was a bonanza, but gold, as spectacular as it was, turned out to be just the appetizer. The real fortune was still buried deep underground, waiting for the 20th century to bring the technology capable of finding it. After the gold rush faded, Alaska settled into a quieter existence. It became an organized territory in 1912 with a proper civilian government, but it remained remote, sparsely populated, and largely overlooked by the rest of the country. The territory's economy relied on fishing, especially salmon, and small-scale mining. The federal government poured in money for military bases, particularly during World War II, when Alaska's strategic position became shockingly relevant. In June of 1942, Japan invaded the Aleutian Islands, capturing the islands of Attu, Kiska, and Agatu. This was the only foreign occupation of American soil during the Second World War, and it terrified the nation. The battle to retake the islands was bloody and costly, but it proved beyond any doubt that Alaska was not just some frozen irrelevance. It was a critical piece of the Pacific defense perimeter. The military buildup that followed the Aleutian campaign brought roads, airstrips, and infrastructure that would shape the territory for decades. The construction of the Alaska Highway, stretching from Dawson Creek in British Columbia to Fairbanks, connected Alaska to the rest of the continent by road for the first time. The Cold War only amplified Alaska's importance. When the Soviet Union emerged as America's primary adversary after 1945, Alaska suddenly found itself on the front line. The Bering Strait, that narrow body of water between Alaska and Siberia, is only 55 miles wide. At their closest point, the American island of Little Diomede and the Russian island of Big Diomede are separated by just 2.5 miles. During winter, you can walk between them when the strait freezes over. This proximity made Alaska one of the most strategically sensitive pieces of real estate on the planet. The United States built radar stations, air defense installations, and military bases across Alaska to monitor Soviet bomber flights and missile launches. Eielson Air Force Base near Fairbanks and Elmendorf Air Force Base near Anchorage became critical nodes in the Continental Defense Network. The distant early warning line, a chain of radar stations stretching across the Arctic, was anchored in Alaska. The territory was, in every practical sense, America's shield against a Soviet first strike. And then, in 1959, Alaska became the 49th state. The statehood movement had been building for decades, but the combination of Alaska's wartime significance, its growing population, and its untapped economic potential finally pushed Congress to act. President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Alaska Statehood Act on July 7, 1958, and Alaska officially entered the Union on January 3, 1959. Statehood came with a critical provision. The new state was allowed to select 100 million acres of federal land to develop as it saw fit. And this is where the story takes its most dramatic turn, because what Alaska chose to do with that land selection would uncover the single greatest economic prize in the territory's history. A petroleum geologist named Tom Marshall had a hunch. He believed that Alaska's North Slope, the vast flat expanse of permafrost stretching along the Arctic coast between the Brooks Range and the Beaufort Sea, might contain significant oil deposits. The geology was suggestive. Millennia ago, this region had been a warm, shallow sea teeming with organic life. As that life died and decayed over millions of years, it created conditions that were ideal for oil formation. Marshall urged the state to include North Slope lands in its selections, and the state listened. In the early 1960s, oil companies began leasing North Slope acreage and drilling exploratory wells. The results were initially discouraging. In 1966, a well drilled near the Sagavanirktok River reached a depth of 13,500 feet and came up dry. It was a crushing disappointment, and some in the industry were ready to write off the North Slope as a dead end. But then, in April of 1967, Atlantic Richfield Company, known as ARCO and Humble Oil, which later became Exxon, began drilling a new well at Prudhoe Bay. On March 12, 1968, the well confirmed what Tom Marshall had suspected all along. Prudhoe Bay was not just an oil field, it was a monster. Subsequent testing revealed that the field contained an estimated 9.6 billion barrels of recoverable oil and 26 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. It was almost twice the size of the next largest oil field in North America, the giant East Texas field. The discovery focused worldwide attention on Alaska and transformed the state's economy overnight. The scale of the find is almost impossible to overstate. The original oil in place at Prudhoe Bay was estimated at 25 billion barrels. Since production began on June 20th, 1977, after the completion of the 800-mile Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the field has produced more than 17 billion barrels of oil. At its peak in 1988, Prudhoe Bay was pumping 1.5 million barrels of oil per day. The pipeline itself, an 800-mile engineering marvel stretching from Prudhoe Bay to the port of Valdez, cost roughly $8 billion to build and remains one of the largest private construction projects in history. The economic impact was staggering. In 1969, the state of Alaska held a competitive lease sale for North Slope acreage and received a record $900 million in bids. Since 1977, Alaska has generated over $180 billion in oil revenue. The state abolished its income tax. It created the Alaska Permanent Fund, a sovereign wealth fund financed by oil revenue, which today holds assets worth tens of billions of dollars. Every year, the fund pays a dividend to every resident of Alaska, a direct cash payment simply for living in the state. The entire social contract of Alaska, its government, its infrastructure, its public services, is built on oil money that was sitting beneath the frozen tundra that Russia sold for 2 cents an acre. And oil was not the only treasure. Alaska's natural resource endowment reads like a fantasy. The state is home to 49 of the 50 minerals identified by the United States Geological Survey as critical to national security and economic stability. These include antimony, cobalt, graphite, lithium, nickel, tin, tungsten, platinum, and rare earth elements, materials that are essential for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to missile guidance systems. The Red Dog mine in northwest Alaska produces 4% of the world's zinc, along with significant quantities of lead, silver, and germanium. Copper deposits in the state are enormous. Gold mining continues to this day, contributing hundreds of millions of dollars annually to the state's economy. Alaska's fisheries are the largest and most productive in the United States. The state accounts for roughly half of all commercially caught seafood in the country. Salmon, pollock, crab, halibut, and herring pour out of Alaskan waters in quantities that sustain a multi-billion-dollar industry. The timber resources, concentrated in the Tongass National Forest, the largest national forest in the United States at nearly 17 million acres, include enormous stands of Sitka spruce, western hemlock, and red cedar. An estimate from the Warsaw Institute noted that roughly 13% of the world's untapped oil reserves and 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas reside within Alaska's borders. These are numbers that would make any nation's treasury minister weep with envy. And all of it, every ounce of gold, every barrel of oil, every ton of zinc, every salmon pulled from an Alaskan river, belongs to the United States because Russia decided to sell it for $7.2 million. Now, let us return to Russia for a moment and consider the weight of what was given away. The decision to sell Alaska was rational at the time. Russia was broke. The territory was generating almost no revenue. It was indefensible. The fur trade had collapsed. The British were circling. And the $7.2 million that the Americans paid was, in 1867, a meaningful sum. It was not nothing. But what Russia failed to account for, what no one on either side of the negotiating table could have predicted, was the sheer scale of what lay beneath the surface. The gold alone would have dwarfed the purchase price within a few decades. The oil made the purchase price look like a rounding error. It is sometimes called Siberia's Siberia, and that nickname captures the Russian attitude toward Alaska perfectly. It was too far away, too cold, too expensive, too difficult. Russia was looking eastward into Central Asia and southward toward the warm water ports of the Black Sea. Alaska was a distraction, a leftover from an era of fur trading that had already passed. The sale was not irrational, but it was catastrophically short-sighted. And this raises a question that echoes through history, a question that applies not just to Alaska, but to countless other moments when nations, companies, and individuals have parted with assets whose true value they could not yet see. How do you put a price on something when you do not know what it contains? How do you evaluate a piece of land when the technology to unlock its wealth has not yet been invented? Russia sold Alaska before the internal combustion engine existed, before the oil industry as we know it existed, before anyone understood the strategic importance of Arctic geography in an age of intercontinental missiles and nuclear submarines. The irony is painful, and it is layered. Russia sold Alaska to deny the British a strategic advantage in the Pacific. A century later, the United States used Alaska as its primary defensive position against Russia itself. The radar stations that tracked Soviet bombers during the Cold War sat on land that had been Russian territory within living memory. The military bases that housed American fighters and interceptors were built on permafrost that Tsar Alexander II had signed away for the price of a small neighborhood in Manhattan. And today, as geopolitical competition in the Arctic intensifies, as climate change opens new shipping routes through waters that were once permanently frozen, Alaska's importance is growing again. The state sits at the crossroads of trade routes connecting Asia, Europe, and North America through the Arctic. Its military installations are being upgraded and expanded. Its critical mineral deposits are being evaluated with fresh urgency as the United States seeks to reduce its dependence on Chinese supply chains for the materials that power the modern economy. There is a somewhat dark footnote to this story as well, one that is worth acknowledging. The deal between Russia and the United States was negotiated entirely by two empires disposing of territory that neither of them had any natural right to claim. The indigenous peoples of Alaska, the Tlingit, the Haida, the Aleut, the Yupik, the Inupiaq, and many others, had lived on this land for thousands of years before the Russians arrived. They were not consulted about the sale. They were not compensated. They were not even mentioned in the Treaty of Cession as anything other than background inhabitants of the territory being transferred. The wealth that has since been extracted from Alaska, the gold, the oil, the minerals, the fish, was extracted from land that belonged to these communities long before any European power drew a line on a map. This is not a secondary detail. It is a fundamental part of the story, and it complicates any narrative that frames the Alaska Purchase purely as a triumph of American foresight. Still, from a purely financial and strategic perspective, the Alaska Purchase stands as one of the most consequential decisions in American history. William Seward, the man who was mocked as a fool, who endured years of public ridicule for spending what his critics considered an absurd sum on a block of ice, turned out to be one of the most visionary statesmen the country ever produced. He did not live to see the gold rush. He did not live to see the oil boom. He died in 1872, just 5 years after the purchase, still carrying the stain of Seward's folly on his reputation. History has long since vindicated him, but the vindication came too late for the man himself. The story of the Alaska Purchase is, in the end, a story about vision and about the failure of vision. It is about the difference between seeing what something is and seeing what something could become. Russia looked at Alaska and saw a frozen liability. Seward looked at it and saw a continent's worth of possibility. The Russians were thinking about the next decade. Seward was thinking about the next century. In the gap between those two timelines, the gap between short-term pragmatism and long-term imagination, was worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Every barrel of oil pumped from Prudhoe Bay, every ounce of gold pulled from a creek near Fairbanks, every salmon hauled from the Bering Sea, every military installation standing guard against threats from across the Arctic, all of it traces back to a single night in 1867, when two men sat in a room in Washington and signed a piece of paper that transferred a piece of the earth the size of a subcontinent for less than the cost of building a single modern skyscraper. Russia sold Alaska for almost nothing, and America found a fortune. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this with someone who appreciates the hidden forces behind history's biggest decisions. Every like and subscription helps bring more of these stories to life. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.